Welcome to the Cold Steel Surgical Podcast with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball.
Dr. Shiva Jayaraman is a minimally invasive and hepatobiliary surgeon at St. Joseph's Hospital in Toronto. He's been traveling around the world talking about his innovative peer-to-peer coaching program for bile duct injuries. Not only is this such an important clinical topic that every general surgeon in the world has to deal with, but his group's approach to coaching is so valuable and is something that we really need to be replicating on a national and international level if we really want to raise the game for surgeons all around the world. We've divided our interview with Shiva into two parts. The first part is our interview about his coaching program, and the second is a YouTube masterclass on his approach to tough gallbladders. Make sure you head over to our YouTube channel, subscribe to that to watch all our other videos. Make sure you head over to Shiva's YouTube channel as well to watch his amazing videos. Dr. Jayaraman, thank you so much for joining us today on the Cold Steel Podcast. It's super late. It's 10 o'clock here. So we really appreciate your dedication to the topic and for joining us today on the Cold Steel Podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I have to say the adrenaline's going. It's a topic that I love talking about, and you guys are people I love talking to. So it's good to be here, and time is no object.
We really appreciate that. Can you tell us, for the few folks who don't know you and your training pathway, can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where you did your training?
I'm originally from Ottawa, born and raised in Ottawa. I think I had a very, idyllic, utopian upbringing, and it was a great place to grow up in the sort of 70s, 80s, and 90s. I was the child of first generation immigrants to Canada, and I think like a lot of people who looked like me and had the experiences that I probably had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. Had a lot of things to prove, or at least wanted to prove things. And so like a lot of people in my generation, I gravitated to medicine because, I was good at school, I was good at science, and I liked talking to people, and we were very middle class. And so I think, medicine seemed like a logical fit for me and the way I was raised. And so that's kind of why I gravitated towards getting into medical school. And so I ultimately went to med school at Western. I got in off the wait list. It was the only place that I got an interview to, and it's the only place that gave me a chance. And I went there thinking I'd be there for 4 years, and then I ended up staying there, I think, for 12 years. Kept finding reasons to stay. After my medical school, I stayed at Western for my general surgery residency, and I'm really grateful for that residency program, for my teachers and the generosity that they shared their knowledge and the generosity with which they tolerated my imperfections to help me become probably the surgeon I am today. And a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today actually come out of things that I probably absorbed, witnessed, or kind of integrated into kind of surgeon I wanted to be through those experiences. From there, I did a kind of funny thing. I did a fellowship in minimally invasive surgery, which of course isn't funny, but it really wasn't a destination for me. I viewed it as a necessity. We didn't get great minimally invasive surgical training when I was a resident. Chad and I are of the same vintage. He was bald before I was, but Chad and I interviewed together, and I've known Chad for a long time. But, when we went through training, if you could do a 15-minute gallbladder, you're a good minimally invasive surgeon, right? And so lap colons were not as ubiquitous as they were now. If people were doing lap colons, the idea of an intracorporeal anastomosis was very rare. I felt really out of necessity. I didn't want to come out of the starting blocks and be obsolete, but also I saw opportunity. And my passion was always to do HPB surgery. It's probably why I chose general surgery. And so I saw an opportunity to kind of do both. And I was lucky enough after my fellowship at Western and in minimally invasive surgery, where I also did a master's in electrical computer engineering in conjunction with my fellowship. I ended up going to Memorial Sloan Kettering as a rare direct entry HPB fellow. I don't even think they do that anymore, and got some really wonderful training, made some great contacts before ultimately settling here in Toronto at St. Joe's. So I've been here for 14 years, and it's been great.
It's not necessarily an intuitive marriage between minimally invasive surgery and HPB. And, it's interesting, even at SAGES last year, the year before, they were showing graphs of rates of MIS HPB surgery. And those rate, like you look at like MIS colorectal surgery and it's like whoosh, taken off, especially with the advent of robotics. That graph hasn't really changed over the last 20 years or so for HPB. And you were pursuing this dual fellowship like way before it's really become in vogue or popular to marry those two interests. So what was it about those two things that you felt like could be married at the time that you decided to pursue those fellowships?
Yeah. So if I'm being honest, Amir, I'm going to say it's going to be hubris. I'm just being honest. Probably trying to be opportunistic, trying to carve out a niche, being ambitious. And what's interesting is probably the better that I've gotten at MIS HPB, the more experience I have as a surgeon, my enthusiasm for the major resections, not necessarily so much based on my own experience, but based on literature, is very guarded. I think we have to be, very cautious as surgeons as to how we integrate new technologies into things that might actually be potentially harmful for patients. And I think as a field, we have there's a lot that we can do to improve how we use data to actually help our patients and not just use data to reinforce our own beliefs. And that's a whole probably separate podcast on its own. But it was probably hubris, but also I think it was there was really an unmet need. I would see things, for example, where we'd see young patients with cystic neoplasms of the distal pancreas come in, and we'd slash them open, and I'd say, all the elements that we're doing here in this open operation we can do laparoscopically. And just because it's the pancreas, it doesn't mean we have to do this open. And I felt the same with a lot of liver surgery that I was seeing. And so actually, I have no training in minimally invasive HPB surgery. Almost every operation I have done in my HPB MIS practice, if I can call myself that, I don't know, I probably could call myself that. Almost everything that I've done, I did for the first time in practice. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but I can tell you a lot about why my academic interests are what they are. I'm like kind of obsessed with failure. I think we can continually improve. That's a lot of hopefully what we're going to talk about today as individuals and as surgeons in general.
Certainly, I think a lot of people have benefited from your training, and certainly I've benefited, even though I'm not an HPV surgeon, but I've learned a lot from watching your videos. And I think this is also a really good segue into talking a little bit about your interest in coaching. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done around bile duct injury coaching and what drew you to that?
There's sort of these things that happen serendipitously to you in your career. And so obviously the coaching thing in bile duct injury specifically was a buildup that took time. That's something that I've really only realistically been doing in an organized fashion for the last 4 years, essentially, almost exactly 4 years. And it started through a culmination of a lot of things. Why bile duct injuries? We have an interesting situation, as you know, Amir, you and I are in Ontario, and all HPV surgery can only be done by certain people in certain centers. With that centralization or regionalization of services that were really focused on oncology only, there's been sort of this erosion of comfort and expertise in the non-oncologic treatment of HPB types of problems, including anything to do with the bile duct or maybe even the duodenum. There's a lot of things that have kind of gone in that direction now. And so when I started practice, I was one of the first people who was hired directly into that stream. Became the second surgeon at my hospital, but still really operating in a largely private practice environment. I had to establish a name, and the way I did it was just by being available, being helpful. Sort of the 3 A's of surgery: be available, affable, and able, in that order. And so we started in our hospital building up, I would say, pretty big volumes of managing biliary and gallbladder related complications. And so we had this critical mass of patients coming through, and we were fixing things. And part of it also has built my practice is the affability part. I've gotten to know a lot of people in the community practice. We follow up, we talk. And so when the pandemic came, and really 4 years ago, almost exactly, people were no longer able to connect anymore. People were no longer, the idea of just, commiserating. And there's actually a lot of really interesting research that's come out in the last few years that surgeons actually, when they have complications, they experience complications, there's serious risk of self-harm. There's serious risk of patient harm, and that they alter the way they practice, sometimes for the worse, maybe by not operating or being overly aggressive. There's like something almost therapeutic about that, sort of the connection we have with each other as colleagues, and the way we can commiserate with one another. It's kind of, when we were residents or fellows sitting in the lounge or room, recollecting and rehashing experiences. That was gone in the pandemic. But what came is this: Zoom. Zoom became available, and someone who was very, quite close to me as a colleague had experienced a bile duct injury, and for years we'd also been, as part of our management of bile duct injuries, we've always done laparoscopies. One of the first things we do for a lot of reasons, which I won't bore you with. And I record all those. And so this individual said, "Hey, do you mind just showing me what you thought and walking me through this?" We'd had a lot of material we've been publishing over the years about our approach to safe cholecystectomy. We went through a few things, and that organically is how it started. But then, of course, what happened with the pandemic was we were seeing the worst gallbladders of all time. I think surgeons were operating in very hostile circumstances, and we saw more bile duct injuries. So this was kind of this opportunity that allowed us, "Hey, I did this thing. Do you want to try this?" And there was this sort of real desire for people to connect and decompress. And that's what allowed us to have this really novel experience of coaching in bile duct injury.
That's really cool, Shiva. And I think a lot of us are aware you were looking at it, the concept of coaching and your delivery of coaching in a bit of a different way. I think you're being too humble, different way than even just the platform of Zoom allows. We all talk about coaching within surgery. Sometimes we use different terminology, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is coaching. We talk about it a lot. Everybody likes to talk about it, but very few people can actually deliver the goods. I'm curious from your point of view, what are the take-home messages, the things you've learned over time, over the last 4 years of doing this at a very high level, that you can sort of give the rest of us who are still trying to be better at it?
Again, like a lot of things I feel that have panned out for me in my career or have been good, it's been sort of accidental. I started doing this laparoscopic HPB, and this is really where the coaching started for me very early in practice, because there's a real hunger across the country to do this, and some people that I had known over the years, even previous mentors of mine, had approached me about helping them integrate laparoscopy into their HPB practices, and to do what at the time I called doing the things we should be doing, like distal pancreatectomies and easy liver wedge resections, getting people over the hump. And the interesting thing about mentorship and coaching, they're very different, right? Like when our relationship with trainees is very different than our relationship with each other, right? And the way that we need to communicate with very experienced trainees or peers is different than we have to do with people who are clearly in a learning perspective. But also, probably the most important part, the most important piece is the willingness of the individual who is participating as the receiver of, coaching, the coachee, I guess. That person has to be willing to engage in that. We're actually only now starting to publish some of our experience in LAP HPB, and we have, what's really interesting about our LAP HPB coaching project is we've learned a lot about what people's perceptions of coaching are, because we have a much larger sample size to look at. And when we look at barriers, one of the really telling comments that I have heard is culturally we shy away from coaching in surgery because it implies a lack of knowledge or competency. Particularly, this can be accentuated when we work in a niche area in general surgery and our egos get in the way of us participating and submitting to coaching. This is really fascinating, right? So somebody has to be willing to engage and be willing to receive. But what's really cool about coaching as opposed to mentorship is that you are actually dealing with somebody who has expertise and knowledge that might be actually higher than yours as the coach. And really all you're trying to do is communicate to them what they probably already know how to do, and just show them how to do it safely and give them the support that they can get through it, which is obviously very different than teaching a resident or a fellow how to do an entire operation. People who are in a coaching program come with self-determined objectives. And when I put together the LAP HPB coaching program, that's when I kind of learned about coaching. I learned about this is all accidental. I had no idea what I was doing. I'm not trying to look, Chad. No one's ever accused me of being humble before. I'm not trying to be humble, but I really had no idea what I was doing. We had surgeons coming in, and we said, well, what are we going to do here? Well, let's put up a whiteboard here and get a marker, and let's write down what your objectives are. Let's write down what my objectives are for teaching you, see where we can line up, find the gaps. Let's do this, and then kind of revisit it later. And that's, really foundational to coaching. I didn't know that at the time. And in subsequent sort of work and effort, I've learned these things. So a lot of it was accidental, but for it to work, you need to have someone who wants to be coached. first and foremost, fundamentally, you need to have that. Otherwise, it'll never happen.
Just for anyone who hasn't read your paper or really heard of your work, and correct me if I'm wrong, so just to summarize, what you would do is you recruited surgeons who had had a bile duct injury and reviewed their videos with them and actually coached them through what injuries had happened and how they could go about avoiding those injuries in the future. Is that a fair summary?
There's a couple of steps. The first is, before we even meet, is to provide a lot of resources about safe cold cystectomy in general. This is all stuff that's widely available, either my YouTube channel, the paper that you're referring to, and then the SAGE's 6 steps programs. So really just basic stuff that probably most surgeons have, in some way, shape, or form seen. Then we have a video review over Zoom where we go over the injury. I take screenshots and show kind of where the injury might have happened. We go through the strategies for safe cold cystectomy in greater detail together, and then we basically have an open Q&A. The whole thing takes about an hour to 2 hours, depending on the person. And then afterwards, there's open lines of communication for further feedback. Since this publication, there have been several sort of variations on this theme. We've worked with people intensively who've had multiple injuries to help. I don't know if this is even a fair term to use, but I'll say it, rehabilitate them somewhat. It's more of an intensive coaching algorithm using much of the same strategies, but this would involve, in some cases where I've reviewed multiple videos, had participation with their chief of staff or chief of surgery to help kind of keep the surgeon in a safe zone, keep the patients in a safe zone. And I think what this really shows is that we're probably scratching the surface in terms of what this is able to do or able to accomplish in terms of systems level changes and individual level changes. But that's the basic framework, yes.
These were surgeons who actually volunteered for, like, they requested your coaching, or did you offer it to them?
So in this initial series that is published in the paper that you're referring to is all surgeons who had bile duct injuries that I or one of my partners fixed at my center. As is often the case after these kinds of things happen, and when sort of explaining what was done and how the patient is doing, we would say, look, we have this. If you want it, take it. There were other surgeons who were offered this during the period of time and said, thanks, but no thanks. And since this paper has come out, there have been people who've had injuries at other sites that have been repaired, that have kind of read about this or heard about this and have approached me about participating in the coaching program as well. So it's kind of this sort of organic thing that's out there that people are sort of aware of.
I think one of the things that I was looking for in the paper, and it's obviously hard to to convey what it's like to be in that moment, in those sessions with those surgeons. I'm curious what your thoughts were about sort of the emotions of surgeons who had come through these coaching programs, and were there any moments where you had to, like, kind of deal with the emotional or the real psychological toll that having injury like that had dealt on these surgeons?
A couple of surgeons were especially the first person who kind of got this started. This individual was a friend of mine, and I think that relationship brings out a lot of real emotion. We all know that there's this thing about bile duct injury specifically as a complication for general surgeons, and how this would be viewed as devastating by most general surgeons. And so I was very aware of that. It did come out, and I think, but what it was the thing that I thought was interesting with this analysis that was done. I just want to put a shout out to the resident who put together the methodology for this, Alice Zhu. She's a real star. She did a lot of work to understand the methodology to put together some form of qualitative and quantitative analysis of this information, and she deserves credit for that. But through her questioning and interview, what we found out that was really interesting, and this is why the paper is called "Helping the Surgeon Recover: Peer-to-Peer Coaching," is that this was about much more than just technical, advice. Hey, this is what you could have done better. Probably the most valuable part of it was that the surgeons themselves came out of it not feeling like idiots. They felt empowered. They felt, ready to get back to work. In our health system in Canada, anyway, I don't know about other countries, like, we can't have surgeons who don't feel comfortable dealing with things that are coming through the door. from a systems perspective. From a human perspective, this leads to burnout. This leads to a lot worse than burnout, right? When people have mounting complications and problems. And look, I've had complications and they really hurt me. I can only imagine, and I not even imagine, I know how it's going to affect other people. So that was really, I think, nice to see that there was this sort of measure. I don't want to say measurable. It's not really measurable, but what I thought was a measurable positive impact on the surgeon's mental well-being and sort of well-being in general.
You sort of touched on this a little bit with your comment about the ego kind of getting in the way of facilitating coaching. But why do you think this type of coaching? I mean, all of us have read this Atul Gawande, New Yorker, like Coach in the Operating Room article. Or if you haven't read it, please, whoever's listening, please go read it because it's awesome. But it's surprising to me in some ways that really hasn't taken off more. Do you have any thoughts about why that hasn't taken off more, given the work that you've done?
One of my mentors in residency, Dr. Brian Taylor, who's a retired colorectal surgeon, he was a giant at Western. And he used to say in the middle of the night, you'd be outraged over something that you see. Like, I don't know, internal medicine has somebody with C. diff colitis. Their colon's 50 centimeters and they're giving them, flagell enemas or something like that. I don't know. And you're like, why? Like, why didn't they call us sooner? And Dr. Taylor used to always say, he'd kind of he'd never get mad. He'd say, the eye sees what the mind knows. And when you're a resident, you're like, what does that mean? What are you talking about? And I thought about that a lot, and I say that a lot. And a lot of my residents now, inappropriately apply that to me. Is one of my sayings, which is flattering. But I think when I asked Dr. Taylor what he meant by that, he said, if you're not sure what you're looking at, or you don't know what you're looking at, you're not going to be able to identify it. I think that's cynical and actually incorrect. I think what it is surgeons, we have incredible confirmation bias that no matter what we believe something is or want to believe it is, that's what it is. And it takes a force to change that before, during, and after. It's very difficult. It's this whole M&M round thing where it was inevitable. Every complication is inevitable. Well, surely that's not the case, right? Like, surely, we can have a more granular discussion and actually think about it. And it doesn't mean that we're bad people or bad surgeons, right? Like, not every complication is inevitable. And so this notion of confirmation bias is ubiquitous in surgery. And so I think it takes some kind of sentinel event like this to maybe make people challenge the way they're thinking a little bit, and a timely intervention with something or somebody that they feel safe with. In this initial cohort of individuals, there were a couple who got it started who were safe. Word travels a little bit, and you have something.
I think that's really wise and sage commentary, Shiva. As you point out, you and I have known each other for a long time, so I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you a tough question here. I'm sure recently David Feliciano, one of the great icons of American surgery, died. And one of the things that he talked to some of us who were close to him about, and he would sort of let it out in the interviews here and there that he'd done over time as he sort of went to the end of his career, was that his single largest frustration through essentially 40 years of operating was that the M&Ms were essentially the same at the end of the day. The discussions in terms of or perception or patient selection, all of those themes that we all know come up over and over again hadn't really changed much. So I'm curious how you view that comment. And I'm curious how you would apply it to what you're doing, because at the highest level, you're trying to change that and improve things, obviously, for not only trainees, but working surgeons alike.
I've heard Dr. Feliciano a long time ago, one of the meetings, I can't remember which one, maybe it was the American College, say something along those lines. And I believe he was and continues to be correct about that. And that's not to say that M&Ms aren't useful. I think still talking about it, there's something to be gathered from the discussion. We don't seem to have the culture. It may just be my hospital, but from what I'm hearing from most people, it's in most hospitals, of really being able to confront some of the difficult aspects of decision making or decisions that weren't made, which is still a decision, and how things could have really been changed or improved upon. And not that the coaching actually addresses that right away, but I do think it has a part to play in helping inform what do we do to prevent these kinds of things from happening. If we say that there must have been some flaw somewhere that led to this complication, okay, maybe we just agree that it wasn't inevitable. We don't have to figure out why, but let's just talk about what we do in the future. And this is where I think coaching comes in. Now, what's interesting to me is I've tried to approach the CPSO and the Royal College about looking at this because ostensibly it seems like these are things that I've read in their web pages and in some of their mailings that would be of interest. And I'm not saying this to be silly. Like I'm a community general surgeon in a non-downtown hospital. I don't know that people really look at that really until there's a sort of critical mass and momentum of other people who are looking for this, and somehow somebody directs towards programs like this or other ones that might be out there that might be helpful. I personally believe that this is where the CPSO or other colleges in Canadian provinces should be directing people who have issues with complications that might be more than the one-off, it might be systematic. Rather than focusing on discipline, actually, I think this is probably in the greater public interest than simply disciplining people. Likewise, a lot of the people who've gone through this initial coaching program and people who have subsequently gone through it talk about coaching, and we touch on this in the discussion of this particular paper and the paper that we're working on for laparoscopic HVB resections. A lot of people probably believe that this is probably the most valuable form of CM for us as surgeons who are out there. We live in an echo chamber of our own thoughts, and the eye sees what the mind knows, confirmation bias. And so if we can find ways of submitting ourselves to this and breaking that, we'll be better for it. This is going to sound completely silly, but there's nothing I've done more in my practice than colonoscopy. In 14 years, I don't even know how many thousands of colonoscopies I've done. And last year I went and did the Canadian Association of Gastroenterologists C program for colonoscopy skills improvement. And, it was really transformational. I really submitted myself to it. I learned a lot, and I felt a little embarrassed to think that after all these years of doing colonoscopies, after all these thousands of cases that I'd done, that I felt like I was really just learning it properly for the first time. And you can probably expand that to everything that we all do. If we get a chance to work with an expert and we're willing to listen to them, we're going to be better for it.
Where are you going next with this, Shiva? I mean, you talked about the fact that maybe we should be having this rolled out through CPSO or Royal College or something at a provincial or hopefully even at a national level. But where are you going next with the coaching program, and what vision do you have for specifically the coaching program you built?
Yeah, so what I'm really interested in is sustainability. Obviously, getting the word out that these sorts of experiences are available, I think is important, but sustainability is important. This is very time consuming for the coach. We need more coaches. We need a culture around coaching. So I'm really interested. This is why I'm publishing about this. One of my mentors from fellowship, Mike D'Angelica, he's just a good person, good human being, but he's a really good mentor for young academically minded surgeons to say, you need to find a way of expressing your ideas in a form that people can digest beyond just your YouTube videos and all that. You need to do things in a way that is referenceable. And so we're trying to build out the sort of the publication piece and get our program out there. But really, our program, any program, I think the main thing is people need to understand these things are available to them. We need to keep it open and accessible, and ideally, if at all possible, free or minimal cost to surgeons. We don't want to create barriers. But then beyond that, it's a big load and burden on the coach. So I'd like to coach coaches. So I'm working with my partners to help them. And if there's other surgeons who are interested in learning how to do this, I'm happy to create. I'd love to see a little community all over the country of people who are the kind of the person who does this. We have a way of doing it. Maybe we can do it together. I'd love to see that for bile duct injury, but I imagine there's all kinds of things. I run away from the left ureter. I never see it. I don't go there. If I bring in other people, if the left ureter is around, but for people who are around the left ureter, sometimes they cut it. They probably need something similar. So I think there's lots of opportunity here. I'd love to have a community of people doing this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is something that we need to do exactly like the Americans have, but like, Caprice Greenberg has made the Academy of Surgical Coaching. So maybe we need to think about something like that in Canada. So I'm super excited to see. I know we're super excited to see where you go next with all this work, and I think it's super, super, super valuable. One of the questions we always ask our guests at the end of our interviews is, if you could go back in time and give yourself advice, maybe as an early attending or as a chief resident, what would that advice be?
When you're early on in your training or early on in your career, all of your problems are external to you, in your own opinion, right? As I reflect on, I've had a good career. I have a great practice. I have a wonderful career, but if I'm being honest, I'm not where I want to be professionally. And maybe that's ambition, maybe that's hubris, all these things I've been kidding about here. It could be. But as I reflect on it, I really wish I had someone come back to me and say, when you're sort of 10 or 15 years out from now, don't look externally for answers for why you aren't where you are. You got to look in the mirror, right? Where our strengths are our strengths, but they're also our weaknesses, and we need to be aware of them. We have to have insight. We need to know how to communicate effectively with people that is in line with who we are and doesn't contaminate the message that we're trying to do. So if we're, the same adjectives, you take confident, poised, determined, can be acerbic, arrogant, and egotistical, right? They all kind of mean the same thing. And so knowing who you are earlier in your career is really helpful, not just for your own self-ambition, but it'll make you a better doctor, better colleague, better spouse, better everything, right? And so I wish I had someone to tell me that. So if anybody is listening to this later on, do that, and you can thank me for it later.
Dude, that's awesome.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you have comments or questions, please email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.